I think it relates back to this idea of an ideal. Is a person what he or she is, or is the person most properly understood as what they could become? And I think we understand ourselves essentially in terms of what we believe we could become. Our conscience upbraids us for failure to move in that direction. And so one of the things you do if you challenge yourself is you attempt to transform yourself through tempering into that which you could be. And we're always becoming. We're not static entities, and we always exist in relationship to this ideal. And so the religious pursuit is an attempt to specify the ideal and also to specify it communally. And then we could say, well, you impose challenges to yourself to facilitate your transformation toward the ideal. And everyone understands that. Well, of course you do that. And you ever meet someone who isn't upbraided by their conscience for not being more than they are? I don't think such a person exists. Maybe the hypothetical psychopath. So, and the gratitude, I would say, that's also, insofar as it can be manifested, that's also a decision. Because you could say, the antinatalists, the people who think consciousness is so unbearable that it should just be eradicated, they think, well, the world is so corrupt and so rife with suffering that it would be better if it didn't exist at all. And you can make a perfectly logical case for that. Dostoevsky did it all the time in his novels. So, well, you can take the opposite tack and live out that. And that's a decision. To be grateful is something to strive for. It's something to attempt to manifest, like to be truthful. And it is in spite of your suffering, because the suffering can be absolutely overwhelming. It can be unbearable.
You might have been through something harder. Others have certainly been through something harder. The complaints of the modern world they can't even compare to even 50, 100 years ago. I mean, it's unbelievable what our ancestors not too far from now dealt with. And
yes, and you can say there's something
that really gets into gratitude
in you that's greater than you think that you could call on, and the evidence is that other people have gone through this, and that isn't so much again pointing to a lack in you necessarily as it is something that's hopeful.
What you can
yes,
be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you say, there's a psychologist, Carl Rogers, and he thought you should have unconditional positive regard for your clients, and I don't believe that's true. You should have unconditional positive regard for the parts of your clients that are trying to get better. Now, that doesn't mean you criticize and deal harshly with the other elements. That's not the point. The point is, when you're dealing with someone, are you dealing with who they are, or are you trying to foster who they could be? And which is the better attitude? And it's certainly the case with young people, and perhaps with all of us, that we like to interact with people who are calling out the best in us. If you configure your life so that what you are genuinely doing is aiming at the highest possible good, then the things that you need to survive and to thrive on a day-to-day basis will deliver themselves to you. That's a hypothesis, and it's not some simple hypothesis, right? Because what it basically says is, if you dare to do the most difficult thing that you can conceptualize, your life will work out better than it will if you do anything else. Well, how are you going to find out if that's true? Well, it's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it. So no one can tell you either, because just because it works for someone else, I mean, that's interesting and all that, but it's no proof that it'll work for you. You have to be all in this game. And so the idea is, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. It's like, that's actually a fairly important caution when you're talking about not having to pay attention to what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear. It's like, what it's essentially saying is that those problems are trivial in comparison. And the probability is that if you manifest yourself properly in the world, that those things will come your way is extraordinarily high. And I believe that that's exactly right. I mean, I've watched people operate in the world, and I would say that there is no more effective way of operating in the world than to conceptualize the highest good that you can and then strive to attain it. There's no more practical pathway to the kind of success that you could have if you actually knew what success was. And so that's what this sermon is attempting to posit. It's like in the story of Pinocchio. What happens at the beginning of the story of Pinocchio is that Geppetto wishes on a star. We talked about that a little bit. And so what Geppetto does is align himself with the metaphorical manifestation of the highest good he can conceptualize, and he makes a commitment. Let's say he aims at the star, and for him the star is the possibility that he can take his creation, a puppet, right, whose strings are being pulled by unseen forces, and have it transform into something that's autonomous and real. Well, that's a hell of an ambition. And we're wise enough to put that in a children's movie, but too foolish to understand what it means. It's such an interesting juxtaposition that we can both know that and not know it at the same time. You can go to the movie, you can watch it, and it makes sense, but that doesn't mean that you can go home and think, well, I know what that meant. Well, people are complicated, right? We exist at different levels, and all the levels don't communicate with one another, but the movie is a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is there's no better pathway to self-realization and the ennoblement of being than to posit the highest good that you can conceive of and commit yourself to it. And then you might also ask yourself, and this is definitely worth asking, is do you really have anything better to do? And if you don't, well, why would you do anything else? You remember the old fable of the grasshopper and the ant? Maybe not. I'm not going to tell it, but the ant works and the grasshopper fiddles, and the ant has a pretty good time in the winter and the grasshopper dies. And so this is like a pro-grasshopper line, but it's not, because it says something else. It says that if you orient yourself properly and then pay attention to what you do every day, that works. And I actually think that that's in accordance with what we have come to understand about human perception, because what happens is that the world shifts itself around your aim, because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. And so you have an aim. Well, let's say your aim is the highest possible aim. Well, then, so that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim, and then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems, and if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim, and you can concentrate on the day, and so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning. That's how, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. Well, and then the issue is, well, back to Noah. Well, all hell's about to break loose and chaos is coming. It's like when that's happening in your life, you might want to be doing something that you regard as truly worthwhile, because that's what will keep you afloat when everything is flooded. You might say, well, what would you want to be king? You could say king of the world or king of your own soul. What do you want to subordinate yourself to? How about your heroic willingness to encounter the unknown and articulate it and share that with people? There's no nobler vision than that. And I don't say that it's merely arbitrary. And it's not merely arbitrary too, because if you do that, to the degree that you do that, assuming your society isn't entirely corrupt, you will be successful. It will actually aid you practically. You'll rise up above men. You'll be selected by women. You'll be admirable. You'll be valued. And you know that because if you look at the people that you admire and value, again, unless you've taken a detour into dark places and are possessed with admiration for people who are working for malevolent purposes and for destruction. You just have to watch the people that you admire and try to figure out what's common across them and draw your own conclusions. And you can ask yourself too, when you're torturing yourself with your conscience because you're not doing what you should be and you know it, what is it that you're torturing yourself in relationship to? You have a vision of your own ideal, and you torment yourself if you're not matching it. What's the ideal? Well, you don't know, right? It's kind of incoherent and poorly articulated, but that doesn't mean it isn't trying to manifest itself and make itself known to you. That's part of what tradition is supposed to teach you by presenting you with examples of great people of the past. The lesson is not supposed to be exactly bow down and worship these people. It's be like them. Be like them. And you could be. And I mean, that's really the goal of the humanities. When it's the humanities, if it's not, if that's the goal, then students will study the humanities. As soon as that ceases to be the goal, then there's nothing of value there. I mean, great literature tells you the great story of good and evil, always. It's good and evil against a background of chaos and order, always. And the evil characters are there to be bad examples, and the good characters are there to be good examples, or you see the interplay of those forces within a single person. And it's a reminder of who you could be. And you can find out who you should be. It's actually this is something quite mysterious, I believe. And part of the proof, let's say, that we exist in a world of value, your conscience tells you who you should be. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily that it's infallible, but people wrestle with their conscience. You know, there isn't anyone, I've never met anyone who is, you know, narcissists accepted, let's say. Yeah. People are generally tormented by their conscience. And the reason for that is that they're deviating from the path that is their destiny. I mean, and if you don't think that, well, then what do you think? What do you think that conscience is? I mean, I've asked my classes repeatedly, do you have a little voice in your head that tells you when you've done something wrong or you're about to, or a feeling? And they all immediately agree with that. No one finds that a foreign concept. And so if you don't know who you are, your conscience will remind you when you're not, or sorry, if you don't know who you could be, your conscience will remind you when you deviate. And then you can start to attend to that. Think, well, look, I'm actually ashamed when I do this. I should stop. Unless I want to be ashamed all the time, it looks like I should stop. And then maybe you stop doing that, and then your conscience objects to something else, and maybe you stop doing that. And as that happens, you start to develop a vision of who you could be. And the chapter indicates it looks at symbolic representations. It's an examination of a certain symbolic representation of the ideal. And so it's my attempt to assess tradition for what it can tell us about what the ideal human being might be like. And the ideal human being is the person who forthrightly upholds the traditions of the culture and forges a way into the unknown. We went through that, and pulls new information in and rebuilds himself and the world. For you to make contact with the highest of values, you have to bring that down to your particulars and figure out how you do that. It's going to be a way that no one else does it, because you're the only one that's you. But you can aim at something. And the point of the chapter is that you aim at something, and that will shape you as you move towards it. And then your aim will change. You'll move, but that doesn't matter. It gets you going, and you'll be molded across time more and more into the person you could be.
When you're doing it right, what does it feel like?
Well, to begin with, and this happened when I was in graduate school, I had a lot of bad habits. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day, and I drank a lot. I came from this little town in northern Alberta, and like many little towns, especially in northern Canada, the alcohol overuse is de rigueur, and so I noticed when I was in my early 20s that the only time I really regretted what I had done was when I was drinking. Now, it was also interfering with me writing because I couldn't concentrate well enough if I was hungover, but I also couldn't really I couldn't tolerate the emotional strain of what I was writing about when I was hungover. It was I couldn't handle being on the edge because I destabilized my nervous system. In any case, I stopped drinking. And the reason for that was, well, I decided I didn't want to be ashamed of what I was doing anymore. I thought, well, maybe I could not do things that were shameful and then see what my life was like. So that was sort of on the negative end, the constraint end. I think people get, on the more positive end, people get deeply involved in what they're doing if they're in the right place in the right time. So that I would say you can tell, this is the idea of heaven on earth to some degree. When time stops, when you're not aware of the duration of time, when you're so engaged with what you're doing that you're not aware of the duration of time, then you've got the forces of chaos and order balanced properly. You're not stultified and bored. That's an excess of order. Everything's too predictable. You're not overwhelmed. You're dealing with, you're playing tennis at the peak of your game. That's partly what people experience when they're great athletes, when they play.
The zone, yeah.
And they're always stretching themselves to their limit. You can tell that if you watch a gymnast, for example, who has a brilliant performance. They've stretched themselves beyond their domain of competence during the performance. And that's what makes everybody leap to their feet. That's the incarnation given embodiment right there in front of you for some moments. And everyone cheers that on.
That it becomes fleeting in that suddenly you could have a great month and then suddenly something happens, chaos returns. Like it's that we almost forget that moment. You can't hold it.
Well, it requires even to some degree some good fortune to maintain. I certainly haven't been able to do that while I was ill. And time, one of the consequences of my illness, whatever it was or is, was time dilation. Like days lasted weeks. It seemed like minutes lasted hours. And I mean that literally. And that was terrible. The weight of time. It's the weight of brute mortality. It's the weight of self-consciousness. And you escape that immersed properly. So, and that second chapter is a pretty practical chapter. It's like, well, if you're not who you want to be, then think about how you could be better. Take a chance, aim at that, work at it, and see what happens. One of the things I tell young people all the time, I'm not a very typical psychologist in this regard, because psychologists like to pat people on the head and say, you're all right the way you are. I talked to Bishop Barron a while ago, I'm going to broadcast this, and he said that the Catholic priests were trained in the 1960s to kind of be accepting, humanistically. Mm-hmm. You're okay the way you are, And that's such rubbish. It's like, not only are you not okay the way you are, you don't think that anybody else is okay the way they are either. And you don't think your children are okay the way they are. Like, you love them and all that, but you don't want them to stay 3 years old their entire life. You want them to expand and improve and become who they are. And so, instead of telling young people that they're okay the way they are, I tell them that, and it's a terrible message for them if they're desperate. So let's say 10% of the people in my audience are young, maybe they're young men, just for the sake of argument, and they're like not in good shape. They don't have any goals. They're drinking too much. They're watching pornography all the time. They've got no aim. They've got no structure in their life, and they're just bloody miserable. And the misery is twisting them into malevolence, because enough misery will absolutely do that to you. And then what are you going to do? And come along and say, well, you're okay the way you are? It's like, that's the last thing they want to hear. It's like, get your damn act together. You got things to do, and they're going to be difficult. And that there's an echoing Christian message in there, I would say, which is you pick up the weight of your suffering voluntarily, and you walk uphill with it. And that not only gives you the meaning that you need in your life, to stop you from degenerating in a dangerous manner, but it actually makes things better. And so that all has to be part of it. Like, I believe in human ingenuity. I think we can solve all the problems that beset us, but it can't just be, it has to be more than we can enhance material well-being, which is what it tends to be now. It's not enough. And so, and you get brushed off by the apocalyptic types.
You know, I've been an advocate for people to put their lives together. And of course, my life has fallen apart. And so you might ask yourself, well, are you aware of the irony of that? And the answer to that is, well, absolutely. You know, it's shameful. I feel that frequently. And then so you might say, and people tweet this out fairly regularly, you know, who am I to give advice? And I suppose that's a perfectly relevant question. I guess I've always thought, and I said this too in the lectures during the tour, that I don't really think that what I'm doing is giving advice, or if I am, I'm also giving it to me. You know, it's not like I believe that I have all the answers. I have answers that I've found useful while attempting to move ahead. And with this new book, I can show you this. That's what it looks like. The black counterpart to the white book, the previous book.
Out today.
You know, I wrote a lot of it while I was extremely ill. And there were some advantages to that, I think, in that I only kept that material that I felt was reliable under duress. Now, I think probably, perhaps, my creativity was somewhat compromised, and so that may have impacted the book negatively, but it made for more severe editing. For example, the last chapter is be grateful in spite of your suffering. And certainly maintaining that gratitude is something I've struggled with. I think anybody who's in pain chronically struggles with resentment, but I know that resentment poisons. And I think that form of courage. And so I stand by what I've written.
There's this idea in the New Testament, if you knock, the door will open. You think, well, that's an unbelievably, naively optimistic statement that no one in their right mind would possibly give any credence to. But the world is a very strange place. And it is the case that your perceptions of the world and the personality that you inhabit orients itself around your fundamental goal. You're goal-directed creatures. You look forward. We point at everything. Like we're arrows that are aimed at, we're either aimed at something or at nothing, but we have to be aimed. And if you aim at something, then the probability that something will come out of that is radically enhanced. And it might not even be what you aim at to begin with, but that's okay, because what do you know? Like, you might be aiming wrong. If you aim and then move forward, your perspective will change, and then maybe you can shift your aim, and that's fine, but at least you're moving forward. And then the future you want to create is the future that you create. And you might as well create it, because you don't have anything better to do. The other thing that's so important to realize, and this is part of the issue with regards to fragility, is you're all in on this game. You've already staked your life on it. And so you, as far as I can tell, you might as well stake your life on something that you regard as worthwhile, because you're staking your life anyways. And what's the alternative? You're going to stake your life on something you don't think is worthwhile? It's like, how is that an improvement? There's no improvement in that. And so if you want to plow a better pathway forward, then get out the plow and start working it. And that works way better than it works way better than you would think. I've often wondered, and I think it's a reasonable thing to wonder, it's like, we're not doing too bad in this world, you know, things are a lot better than they were 50 years ago, and there's a lot of reason to be optimistic, and there's reason to be pessimistic. But you know, it's not like we're all in making things better. We're maybe 60-40 or 65-35 or something like that, each of us individually and then also collectively. You wonder what would happen if we were all in, just how much better we could make things. And there's something that's worth thinking about. There's something to devote yourself to. It's like, how much suffering could you rectify if that was your goal? Your own and other people's as well. And how much malevolence could you constrain? And what amount of good could you do in the world? That's a noble goal, and it's certainly something worth discovering, unless you have something better to do, and it doesn't seem to me that you do. So, well, especially when you think about good, is not as something that's associated with naive adherence to a set of constraining rules, that all good is obedience. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm saying, look, there's problems that are out there in the world, and some of those problems bother you. They're your problems. Right? I don't know why they bother you and some other problems bother someone else, but there are problems that bother you. Those are your problems. Right? That's your call to adventure. Solve them and see who you are. Put your life together and make something better. That's the way to defeat nostalgia for the false past. And don't be so sure you can't do it. I have this program I'll tell you about very briefly because of the effects it's had that have been surprising to us because we've tested this empirically. It's called the Future Authoring Program, and it's on a site called selfauthoring.com. And it's a program that is designed to help people make a plan for their life. And it's a fairly straightforward program in some sense, although not so much in others. I might say, well, what do you want to do with your life? And you think, oh my God, I can't answer that question. It's like, that's a big question. And so you don't know. Part of the problem is it's not a very good question. It's not differentiated enough. So if you ask yourself a question that's so large you can't answer it, well, then you should ask yourself a smaller question. And so in this program, you're asked to do things. We tried to make it practical. It's like, okay, it's 3 to 5 years down the road, and you get to have what you need and want within reason, right? Assuming you're taking care of yourself within reason. Well, what might you want? How would you like your family interactions to be going? Siblings, parents? What about your intimate relationship? If you could have what you wanted and needed from that, just what would that look like, hypothetically? Your career or your job, because those aren't the same thing. At least maybe you could have a job that is respectable and that constitutes a valid contribution to those around you and helps justify your position in society. And perhaps you could even have a career, that has some intrinsic meaning independently of that. Your education, your resistance to the temptation of drugs and alcohol and the sorts of things that knock people off the track, your care for yourself mentally and physically, your use of time productively and in an engaging manner outside of work. You could have what you wanted. What would it be? Answer it. Guess if you have to. And then write for 20 minutes about what your life could be like if all of that manifested itself. And then do the reverse. Write about what your life would be like in 3 to 5 years if you let everything about you that isn't good have full sway and take you to your own little subdivision of hell. And people are pretty aware of that. Everyone knows. Everyone I've ever talked to has some real sense of how they would degenerate if they degenerated in their own particular way. Some people would become cruel. Some people would become homicidal. Some people would become alcoholic. Some people would end up on the street. Some people would drift into prostitution. People know where their weaknesses are likely to tempt them and take them. And so then you sketch out a little hell and a little heaven, and maybe you're motivated to run from the one, which is good, and to run toward the other. And so then you have a framework for your life. And then maybe you make a strategic plan. Well, we've done that now with thousands of people in Holland and in Canada, mostly university students, well, all university students in the research studies. And we found at this little college in Canada, Mohawk College, that if you brought students in the summer in their orientation and just had them do this program, which should probably take you about 5 days if you did it thoroughly, if you had them do it really badly in an hour, that decreased the probability that the men would drop out in the first semester by 50%. It was a staggering finding, and we found findings of similar magnitude across the other studies. And the reason I'm telling you this is because a lot of the reason that people don't get what they want is because they don't aim at it. This idea that you should have higher self-esteem or that you should be happy, it's like, Jesus, it's so weak. It's so pathetic. It's like, first of all, forget it, because you're not who you should be and you don't deserve your self-esteem. And second, what good is happiness going to do you when you're unhappy? And you will be. So there's nothing in that to get you out of bed in the morning. You need an adventure, and the greater the better. And so it's back to the high seas, gentlemen. Out on the rolling waves where there are new continents to conquer and new things to overcome. And if you think that all the frontiers are gone, then you're not looking, because there's frontiers everywhere, and that's where you should be, right? Working diligently to expand the domain of habitable order into the chaos of potential. And that'll force you to discover who you are and to bring that into the world. And that's the role of men in the 21st century. And there's nothing about that that's anything but good for anyone. I mean, one of the things that I detest about the current collectivist ideology and the insistence that what we live in is a patriarchal tyranny is that it associates the activity of stalwart men with nothing but tyranny and power. And I think that that's dreadful beyond imagining, because it conflates bravery and courage and competence and the desire to adopt responsibility and the ability to be generous with nothing but power. And it gives men, especially young men, an excuse to be useless so that they'll be harmless, so that they won't be destructive. And none of that's helpful. It's like you're a dangerous creature, and that's a good thing. And you should harness that and discipline it towards some impossible goal, one you can barely lift, and see if you can manage to struggle uphill with it. And then things will straighten themselves out. And then we won't have to ask, well, what's the role of men in the 21st century? There are terrible problems that need to be solved. Solve them. It's within our power to solve them. It's within your power to solve the problems that present themselves to you as your problems. Solve them. That's the right solution. And there's nothing in that isn't good. And there's nothing in it that isn't like that call to adventure that can get you up in the morning when it's a difficult morning, when things have collapsed around you for one reason or another. You need a purpose for moving forward, and it has to be the sort of purpose that justifies the suffering. So that's that. Many times in life, people don't get what they want and they need because they don't aim at it. And it's a hard lesson for people to learn because they're cynical to begin with and they presume that there's no possible way of moving forward. But it's not so unreasonable to assume that you're not going to hit what you don't aim at, or you're not going to hit what you aim at and don't shoot at. And I've seen time and time again that if people do put forward a vision for what they regard as worthy of pursuit, which is something you have to determine in dialogue with yourself. It's like, given the difficult preconditions of existence, is there anything that you could conceive of that you would regard as sufficiently worthwhile so that you would be motivated to pursue it? It's a profound philosophical question, and it's not an unreasonable one. It's a good place to start. It's like, well, life is difficult enough to make you cynical and bitter, and perhaps enough to make you cynical and bitter and suicidal and homicidal and even genocidal. And it's not surprising in some sense. And then the question is, well, is there something that you can pursue that allows that to be acceptable or perhaps even desirable, which is something to do that justifies the suffering? And it's hard to say what that would be for each of you. It's something that you can discover. This is partly why Nietzsche was wrong. Nietzsche thought that after God had died, that human beings would have to invent their own values. But the psychoanalysts, I would say Jung foremost among them, put forward a very powerful counterclaim, which was that, well, you can't invent values. They're already built into you. You have to discover them. And I think that's true for each person. It's like, well, what would justify you in in the abandonment of your resentment and hostility? What would be a sufficiently adventurous goal? And this is part of the problem with the collectivist viewpoint, I believe. I was thinking about that today too. You know, I learned as a psychotherapist not to solve my clients' problems for them. You're a bad therapist if you offer advice. I mean, you do sometimes, because there are situations that are relatively trivial that just need to be strategized through. But fundamentally, what you want to do, if you're careful, as a friend or a family member or as a psychotherapist, is to help the person discover their own pathway forward, right? And that's going to be a difficult pathway, because it means that they're going to have to accept the burden of their life. And then they're going to have to come up with their own solutions to what would justify that burden. And if they come up with their own solutions, then often they find one that at least in part justifies the burden. And the problem with the collectivist perspective, especially the one that portrays you as a victim, is that it's always up to someone else to solve your problems. It's not like you don't have the problems. You know, the idea that in some sense you're an eternal victim, well, there's a truth in that, given that nature is conspiring to destroy you and will be successful in the end, that you're undermined by your own society at the same time you're buttressed by it, and that you're a target of your own malevolence and that of others. I mean, so there's a triad of tragic and malevolent forces that are aimed directly at your heart, and that's always the case. But to not take responsibility for that and to attribute to that to a cosmic injustice or a sociological injustice in some sense that's aimed particularly at you, that's somehow the fault of others, is to miss the great adventure of your life. One of the things I learned last year, I was doing a series of biblical lectures, and I started to analyze the Abrahamic stories, which I didn't know very well. And the story of Abraham is particularly interesting because he's a slow starter. He's one of those guys that failed to launch, right? He's in his father's tent, hanging around his mother's skirts till he's 80. And 80, that's exactly it. And God finally gets fed up with him and says, look, why don't you get the hell out of the tent and get out there in the world and have an adventure? You know, your life is waiting for you. And well, it's God calling, so Abraham has enough sense to pack up and leave, but it's complete bloody catastrophe from there on in, you know. I mean, the first thing he encounters is a famine, and that's no joke, and then it's a tyranny, that's the next thing, and then it's a conspiracy to steal his wife. And I'm sure that he spent the next 20 years wondering why in the world he ever listened to God and just didn't stay in his damn tent. You know, but there's the Abrahamic story and the stories that follow that they all have that same narrative structure, is that there's this call to adventure, but it's not to happiness by any stretch of the imagination. It's to a heroic mode of being that involves taking responsibility for the full catastrophe, and that in that adoption of that adventurous mode of being, there's a deep meaning to be found, right? A meaning maybe that transcends just you, that involves your family and that involves your community and maybe even the destiny of humanity itself. But there's nothing about that that's secure or easy, and very little that has to do with happiness. The idea that your problems should be solved for you, let's say, and that it's unfair that you have them, well, it's attractive in that there's nothing for you to do except complain, but it's horrifying in that there's nothing for you to do except complain. The difficulty is actually, the funny thing is the difficulty is actually the destiny. And it is insanely difficult, but maybe you're insanely up to the task. You know, and I would also say, there is evidence for this, you know, in the clinical literature. We know that one of the main strategies that you can use to help people cure themselves is for them to grapple with what they're terrified by. Grapple with what they're terrified so badly that they're avoiding. And to learn to confront it in pieces, in stages, in manageable stages. Not too much, you know, because you can hurt yourself, but not too little, because then it's pointless. And it works. It makes people not less vulnerable, but more courageous and stronger, which is better than being less vulnerable, because good luck with that. That's not happening. But you can be more courageous and you can be stronger. And if you take on the burden of confronting the catastrophe of your existence, then that happens. And it actually works. And that's part of what everyone is called upon to discover in their life, and partly what religious stories try to remind people of, in some sense, to wake them up, say, you're more than you think you are. And this is another thing I realized on this tour, actually. I hadn't conceptualized this properly before. There's this old idea that the hero rescues his father from the abyss, or from the belly of a great monster, the dead father. You see that reflected in stories like Pinocchio in the Disney movie, because the puppet rescues Geppetto from the belly of a whale, the most terrifying possible place, at the bottom of the lowest possible abyss. And what that means is this, is that if you stare, and this is the answer to the Nietzschean dilemma. Nietzsche said, beware of staring. If you look long into an abyss, then the abyss looks into you. Well, if you look long enough into an abyss, then you discover something at the bottom of it. And what you discover at the bottom of it is your dead father. And what that means is that if you look at what terrifies you forthrightly enough, then you discover the spirit of your ancestors that you could become. And that won't be called out of you without that courageous confrontation. Because nothing is called out of you without it being demanded. It's the same as working out in a gym. You lift heavy weights, not so heavy that they hurt you, but heavy enough so that they're slightly beyond your capacity to grasp. Nothing is compelled out of you without necessity. And so then you ask, well, what if you subject yourself to the highest possible level of necessity? Maybe then the possibility is that the best there is called forth out of you. And that's a union with all the great, that's the union with what's greatest about humanity in the past, because that's in you. But it's not going to come out without compulsion, and the compulsion that you set upon yourself. And so that's the antidote to the collectivist viewpoint. It's like, it's your problem, and thank God for that. Because you need a problem to justify your miserable existence. And it has to be a problem of sufficient magnitude so that you can look yourself in the mirror when you wake up in the morning and you can think, well, despite my inadequacy and all the things about me that are insufficient, at least I'm bearing up under this worthwhile load. And that's a start. So, thank you. The circuit that we use to defend ourselves against predators, as we've evolved cortically, that circuit has come to represent what we don't know in general. Because the predators, of course, inhabit where we don't know. And so evolution is a conservative force, and we use the circuits that we've evolved to represent new things. And so the unknown, the chaos, is often represented by a monster that swallows you up and pulls you down. And you know, when you're feeling terrible, you don't say, well, I'm feeling up. You say, I'm feeling down. Well, why is that? Well, down is worse. I guess you're flat on the ground when you're down, or you're in a hole or something like that. You're hiding in a hole. You know, it's down. And you're threatened by something. You know, maybe you're threatened by your own inadequacy. That might be part of it. Maybe that's partly what you imagine as a monstrous force, because, you know, your proclivity towards procrastination and your weakness of character is part and parcel of why you happen to be in the underworld. And that's the underworld, the mythological underworld. That's where you go when things fall apart. And if you understand that, if you know that that's what that means, then you have one of the keys that opens up ancient stories to you, and you understand things. Your life can be organized, going very well, and then something comes up, and poof, everything changes. Some axiom that you were living by, and it might be the existence of a partner, it might be a job, it might be your health, any of those things, gone. And you go somewhere when that happens. You go somewhere. It's a state of being. You're still in the same world, but it's not the same at all anymore. Everything about it is different. It's all negative and dark, and you don't know what to do. You're confused. And so, what do you do down there in the underworld when things have fallen apart? Especially if it's the worst possible case scenario and you realize that you actually had something to do with your demise. That's really annoying, you know, when something bad happens to you and then, you know, you grind yourself into bits trying to figure out what the hell happened, and then you realize that, well, you were playing a causal role. Now, sometimes you're so depressed you assume you're playing a causal role and you weren't. It's not easy to figure out by any stretch of the imagination. And it isn't that everyone who does something terrible is at fault for it, but sometimes you find that you were off the path somehow, and maybe even that you knew it and you didn't attend to it, and that's why all of this hit the fan. And so then down there in that chaos, you decide that you're going to do what you're supposed to do instead. And then maybe you get to rise up again, renewed, if you're lucky, and then you can go fix the city. And that's what this story's about. And that's why I picked the image to represent the course, because really what happens, you see, with the psychoanalysts, the road to health, if you're not doing well, which means that as you act in the world you're not getting what you want, there's something wrong with the match between your presuppositions and your actions, habitual, and the way the world is responding to you. And so it's not turning out for you. And the question is, well, what can you do about that? And one answer might be to examine yourself for presuppositions and action patterns that are not serving you well, and to find out what they are and what to do about them. And maybe some of that is, maybe you're not moving forward because of fear, and maybe that fear is grounded in terrible experiences that you had in the past that you've never been able to understand. And maybe one of the ways of gluing yourself back together and expanding your personality so that you could in fact live properly in the world is to go back to those terrible events and untie them and straighten them out and understand them and drop them. To navigate, there's two things you need to know. And the first is, where the hell are you? Exactly, precisely, right? Razor sharp. What's good about you and what's bad about you? By your own reckoning. You don't have to, you can ask other people, but this is a game you play yourself. It's like, as far as I'm concerned, I'm taking stock. What is it that's okay about me and what needs some work? And you got to watch to not be too self-critical when you're doing that too, because that can just be another kind of flaw. And then the next is, okay, well, where are you going? What's your destination? Well, and that's what the frame is. Now, you know, you could do that in a very sophisticated way. And you do that by thinking consciously about who it is that you are in an articulated manner, and where you want to go and why and how you're going to get there. And people hardly ever do that. That's come as such an absolute shock to me as an educator. I just, because one of the other programs, I use this in my classes. One of the other programs in this suite of programs is called the Future Authoring Program, and I started developing it in my Maps of Meaning class, which is where some of this material is from. And I got students to write about their past. It's like, okay, we're talking about stories, so let's tell your story. Who are you? How did you get here? And what are you now? That usually helps people put things to rest, although it's quite stressful while you're doing it. Stress goes up when you're doing it, and maybe you feel miserable for a couple of weeks, and then stress goes down and it stays down. So that's also why people don't do it, because who the hell wants to have their stress go up? But if
Tell me now, if you want to get out of my life.
it's a sacrifice. So then the next issue is, well, where are you going? And one of the things that, and this I cannot understand. These students that have been in education system for 15 years, 14 years, high-end students, most of them, not once in their whole bloody life did anyone ever get them to sit down for like a day and say, all right, justify your existence. Like, well, seriously, it's like here you are in university, you're taking a bunch of courses, you've got some sort of vague career plan. It's like, defend the damn thing a bit, since you're going to go live it and everything. You're staking everything on it. It's like, what's your damn plan? And why are you so convinced that it's not the plan of a babbling fool? Because if you haven't thought about it, then it is. And if you really want to go out there and live that out, you know, one of the things Carl Jung said was that you're in a story, whether you know it or not. And then he made two nice comments about that. If it's someone else's story, you're probably going to get a bit part. And it might not be the one you want. And if it's a story that you don't know, it might be one with a really bad ending. Or maybe it's just bad, period, with a worse ending. And if you don't know what the story that you're living out is, maybe that's the one. You know, maybe you got that from your mother, you got it from your grandmother, you got it from your aunt, or God only knows where you picked it up, because you pick up things like mad, because that's what human beings are like. So maybe you're living a malevolent tragedy unconsciously. And then one thing you might ask yourself is, well, how wretched and miserable is your life? Let's add futile to that. How wretched, miserable, and futile is your life? And you might say, well, yeah, 70% on each count. It's like, then you're probably unconsciously living out a malevolent tragedy. And maybe that's not for the best. Well, it's either that or the whole universe hates you, right? Or 70% hates you, you know. So anyways, you know, we got students to start writing in detail about not what they wanted. It's not a career thing. Because that's the closest people usually get, is they have a career plan. It's like, no, it's not a career plan. That's peripheral. Important, but peripheral. It's like, all right, you got 3 years, man. You're going to live them anyways. Devote those 3 years to setting the world up around you so that it's the best it could possibly be for you. As if you were taking care of yourself, as if you cared for yourself. Well, what would that look like? You know, let's say, just for the sake of argument, if you figured out where you were, that you could have what would be best for you. Well, what is that? I bet you never asked. People don't ask. And so life comes at them like random snakes, and they sort of fend them off. And life goes by, and things don't work out the way people expected them to. But a huge part of that is they didn't know where they were because they wouldn't look, or didn't know that they should look. Ignorance and willful blindness, right? Two great catastrophes. And they never figured out where they wanted to go or why. Now, there's a problem with figuring out where you want to go. And the problem is that you make your conditions for failure clear to yourself. And people don't like that. So if you keep yourself in the fog, then you can't tell when you screwed up. Now, that isn't so good because you're still screwing up. You're just too blind, self-blind to notice. Although in the short term, that's less painful. If you make your criteria for success razor sharp, then you know every time you screw up. But that's great, because then you could fix it. You could either repair the behavioral inadequacy or the conceptual inadequacy that you're using as a tool in that situation, or maybe you could adjust your damn plan. Either way, you can fix it. If you don't do that, if you don't do it consciously, and this is what the psychoanalysts pointed out, is that you have innumerable quasi-autonomous subsystems that make you up that will generate stories impulsively, and you'll just act them out. And you know that because you watch yourself over 2 weeks and you think, Jesus, I did a lot of stupid things in the last 2 weeks. And you think, why? And it's because you're a collection of somewhat random, quasi-autonomous personality units, and lacking a leader, they're just going to fire off whenever they want. You know, first you're hungry, then you're thirsty, then you want to go to bed with your wife, you know, then you want to sleep in, then you want to tell your boss off, then you want to curse at the guy that cuts you off in traffic. It's like, you're kind of like a 2-year-old, you know, just it's one emotional frame after another vying for dominance. There's no overarching hierarchy, and there's no king at the top.